Thanks for being here. I heard there was a lot of late night partying last night, so I'm glad to see you all here this morning. Our topic is philanthropy. A few notes about the session. Please silence your cell phones. We're going to do Q&A, so wait for the microphone before speaking. And please, after the session, take a few seconds to complete the survey. I'm told the response rate has been very low. Let's try and do a little better in this room. My name's Mark Gunther. I'm a writer who covers philanthropy and nonprofits. And I'm just going to whip down and quickly introduce our panel. You have access to their bios if you want to know more. They're all obviously distinguished leaders in the field. That's why they're here. To my immediate left is Laleh Ispahani, Open Society Foundation, Darren Walker, Ford Foundation, Pia Infante from the Whitman Institute, and Minister Lilianne Ploumen from the Netherlands, where she leads their foreign affairs minister. My first question is going to be a very easy, open-ended question, so you can take it wherever you want. Relax. We'll save the hard ones for later. Lots of things have happened since the 2016 Skoll Forum. How has your world, how has your work changed since then? Give me the most significant thing you're doing differently today than you were doing a year ago, and I will start with you, Minister Ploumen.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a very relevant question because in this part of the world, but also in other parts of the world, many things changed, and they changed for a good part because of a participative democracy. I mean, we will obviously be critical on some of the outcomes of decisions that are taken, but I think we should remember what happened here in the UK, what happened in the United States. It's all part of democracy. Now, I'm part of democracy too, and so which I think gives a lot of legitimacy to what I can do and how the government of the Netherlands acts. And so, of course, we've been responding to events that have happened all over the world. And let me just take one. When President Trump signed the Mexico City policy, which many Republican presidents before him also did, he basically signed a policy that says organizations that provide information about safe abortion to women and girls, to men and boys, and give access sometimes to safe abortion as a last resort measure, those organizations should choose. They either stop that service or they don't get any US funding anymore. Which means that organizations that give information about family planning, maternal health care, sexuality education, that they will be affected heavily if they say, you know, this is what we think our values are, and this is the services that we give to women and girls. And so I decided that that would not be a good way to promote women's rights, and I thought we need to do something different. We need to step up, and that's why I took the initiative She Decides, promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights for women and girls all over the world, trying to bridge the funding gap that started by the president signing this policy, which is about $600 million a year, quite significant. And so I decided to initiate it, hoped that, you know, others would join what I would like to become a movement. And then in 4 weeks, more than 50 countries had joined and signed up. Many, many foundations have signed up and joined and contributed. And so in 5 weeks, we already got 181 million euros to compensate. And we got a lot of, as important as the funding, don't ever underestimate the power of money, as important as the funding, of course, is that we have shown that there is a community globally that wants to stand up for the rights of women and girls. And we could use a bit of that. Not only looking Thanks. And on a personal note, I have to say, I've been involved in issues of women's rights for as long as I can remember. I've been an activist for as long as I can remember. I work with a fund called Mama Cash in the 90s. Thanks. And so, but at that time, of course, we were promoting the same values and the same rights for women and girls, but we sometimes thought, who else but us and our 500 friends and allies are interested in this cause? It was so very difficult to get like a large-scaled public support. And so it was also on a personal level, it was very, very wonderful to see how so many people got together. When I walk in the streets, when I have time to do my shopping myself, I do it. But so when I'm in a shop, people just approach me, people from all walks of life, old, younger people, men, women. And so it's amazing to feel that vibrancy. And so I think that's the very hopeful message that I would give, looking at what has been not too good a year.
And a brief follow-up, have you raised money in the US, and how has that gone? And if you want to name a name or two, feel free.
Yeah, we did raise money in the US from citizens. Every day I get postcards from US citizens who say, you know, thank you, Minister, for taking the initiative. We did get 50 million from a large anonymous US-based donor. Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put in 20 million euros. And so, yeah, there has been a lot of support financially, but also, you know, in terms of voicing support, which I think is very important too.
Darren, let's let you go next.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you all for being here.
And talk about whatever you want, whether it's related to...
Isn't it a lovely day here at Oxford?
I mean, you made...
The weather's so beautiful.
No, you made some news this week, so I don't want to steer you away from there.
No, but thank you, Sally. Congratulations. Another amazing school for him. Thank you. So I really am so honored because I know and admire everyone on this panel, and I think I am worried about democracy, actually. And so when you, the good minister, I think, has inspired people around the world with her She Decides campaign, which has been so impactful, and we're so grateful for your singular leadership in making that happen. But I actually think that democracy has not worked. When half of the voting public in the United States chooses to not participate in the process, when thousands of American citizens, because they have a previous record in the criminal justice system, have been stripped of their basic right of citizenship to vote, I actually challenge the idea that democracy is really working. And part of the reason democracy isn't working is because too many people feel that the systems of government and the systems of the economy and participation are rigged. And in some ways, they're right. And I think the work of philanthropy is to hopefully support and contribute those actors in civil society, those people working on the front lines, to provide hope and dignity. And so we at Ford, and I know both of your foundations as well, are very engaged in this journey to say, how do we have a world where people can live with dignity? And certainly from the perspective of the United States, dignity really starts with work, with the opportunity to provide a livelihood so that a person and their family can live and not be on the margins. And I think what we've seen is that we have an economy that is reproducing advantage and compounding disadvantage. And so we have to go at those systems and structures and policies that produce these bad outcomes for too many people. And so the work of philanthropy is really to engage in that discourse and to contribute, not we, because we are but merely financiers of a system that is really you, all of you, who are doing the work to demonstrate that it doesn't have to be like this. And so that's our work. It really, for us, when I speak about the economy, it is to ask really uncomfortable questions about, can we have a capitalist system that produces shared prosperity? Because we know that capitalism is amoral. I mean, even though Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, in these contemporary times, I mean, it is really an amoral undertaking. And the question is, how do we imbue our system with a sense of inclusion as opposed to exclusion, with a sense that we should be producing a more shared understanding of who benefits from our system. And so that's the conversation, and that's what we need to be engaged in. And so with respect to markets, one of the reasons we have made this billion-dollar commitment around mission-related investments is because we believe that it's, as a foundation, it's not enough for us to focus on the 5%. The 5% is easy. The 5% is the generosity sort of equation where we can make grants, and the 95% is the justice question. Are we really after a more just society? Because if we really are, we're going to deploy every tool we have towards that mission.
So we'll dig into that a little more. That obviously, that's not something you decided since the election, correct? I mean, this has been in process for longer than that. Did the election or Brexit change the way you approach that at all?
I mean, I think what's so interesting about this is, you know, I gave a talk in September at a conference of, for lack of a better term, elites in San Francisco. And you know, it was one of those typical things where I turn up, I'm the sort of black gay guy on the stage, and I give my talk, and the audience are sort of all white elites, and you know, we have a go at it. And so what was interesting is that in September, and my colleagues at Ford know this because I've been saying this, we were talking about the US and what was happening in the United States. And what was so interesting was, you know, I was the person who said, and they said, well, why are you focusing on inequality? And blah, blah, blah. And I said, because inequality broadens the aperture for understanding exclusion in America and the world. And they said, well, explain. And I said, let me be really, really clear. We need to understand what is happening to white people in America, okay? Like white people, like, and it was a little jarring for some people, but what I was saying was something else has been happening in our economy. We have had, I mean, our democracy has the elasticity to understand and withstand intergenerational black poverty. We do not have the elasticity to sustain downwardly mobile white people. And so what I was saying, and what I meant by why inequality is a way in which we have refocused our work is to embrace what is happening and how inequality and exclusion, our traditional normative thinking, which remains true, poor people, women, people of color, et cetera, that's been our traditional, but something else is happening. And the implications in a democracy are really bad because inequality breeds hopelessness. And if people are hopeless, they will do things that shock us, people who don't have to live with inequality. And so we will look at their actions, we will look at their voting patterns, and we will say, what were they thinking? How completely self-defeating and how they're against their own interests and all of those things that we people say about them. When we have to understand that why not drive off a cliff when the status quo offered means you're going to keep giving me what I've now got? I'll drive off a cliff rather than keep doing. And so, are we surprised about Brexit? Are we surprised about the outcomes? And are we surprised when we look at the margins of victory to see who made that victory possible? It's these people.
Well said. Pia, let me turn to you. I know you at Whitman, a smaller foundation, did some very concrete and specific things since the election. So why don't you talk a bit about that?
Right. I'm in a different place now than I was 10 minutes ago. So thank you. Thank you both.
Is this good? Or?
It's uncomfortably good. It's, I mean, I guess I'll just back up to say, I agree with Darren that when the election results happened, and actually long before that, I believe that democracy was in trouble. And one of the things that happened to me viscerally when the election results came in is I come from a Filipino immigrant family. I too am queer, so I have that going on. And, you know, and my parents are, you know, they followed all the rules. They adopted assimilation as a strategy to make it. You know, and just like when the economy crashed and they lost their retirement and so many people lost their homes, and like the results of this election, it's so ever clear to me that assimilation is not a game, that we're going to win. You know, we're not going to win in this way. And I say this because we've been talking about populism, you know, throughout this conference. And it's fascinating to me that in every conversation about populism, no one has described heightened and emboldened racism and xenophobia and misogyny and whatever. I mean, when we are talking about the populist win, we often talk about the economic conditions that created maybe a white votership, you know, to elect Trump. But actually, the truth is, it was so much race baiting, and it was so sexist, the entire campaign, and the tone of the administration. So I could go on in this vein, but I will say that I was personally eviscerated for the millions of people who follow the rules, who put in the good work and put in the good time and just get screwed. So that's my sort of personal take on it. I will say that institutionally, you know, my foundation is a private foundation in San Francisco, and we have always espoused these particular values: humility, critical thinking, dialogue, relationships of integrity, and equity. And because now the mirror of our federal government is not reflecting that, you know, in sort of public consciousness, we felt that it was ever more important to be rooted in our actual values. And I think a lot of foundations and a lot of nonprofit organizations felt that they had to scramble and pivot completely. So I heard stories where people would call me and say, wow, someone who has given me multi-year support for many years has just said, we no longer fund in your area because we're funding all civic engagement. So what I want to say is that as an institution, we rooted in our values. We stayed absolutely committed to our, you know, multi-year unrestricted support grant making to these partners that we've had for many years that also espouse these values. And I think that is very important, actually, to not remake ourselves as a reactive response. Actually, to become more ourselves is what we wanted to do. So I'll just say the two ways that we did pivot, because we also don't want to be in denial about the political and social and economic realities for so many communities that we've always supported: Muslims, women, LGBT, you know, and human rights in general. We decided we had a spend out timeline where we would do all our grant making through 2022. With the election results, we realized that our spend out was basically in the shadow of this administration. So we decided to actually spend all of our dollars, except for a little bit of operating at the end, in the next 2.5 years towards the midterm elections, because we wanted to invest in what the other exciting part, actually, about what's happened in the States is the activation. There's so much activation. It is incredible, and trust me, it's not foundation funded. You know, there's activation, and we wanted to be able to support that grassroots policy candidate, you know, progressive candidates. I have a great story I'll tell later about how actually many foundations don't understand that we can fund C4 activities. So we're delving into that. And the last thing I'll say is that we created, for the first time, a rapid response mechanism. And we funded things like Proteus's National Security and Rights Collaborative protecting Muslim communities, or there's a group called Cosecha who is building a movement for undocumented peoples that's meant to be lasting well beyond any administration. So we created this rapid response technology, and what is hilarious to me actually is that our grant making process was already fairly responsive and fairly rapid. And that in comparison to some other rapid response funds, we've actually expended all of our funds, while some other funds have actually not sent a single check. So I think it is that part, the whole we created a rapid response fund and didn't send a check and now it's April, is actually what I want to say is indicative about philanthropy, particularly in the US. The mechanisms are so ridiculously bureaucratic and absolutely not necessitated by legal measures in any way. So basically, philanthropy has involved itself in a whole bunch of gears and mechanisms that I think is maybe meant to have professionalized philanthropy feel important. I'm not really sure what other reason it exists for. Anyways, I will stop there, but I'm just super inspired to be on this panel.
So you're putting yourself out of a job by?
Absolutely.
By when?
If anyone's looking. No, we will still close our doors in 2022, but we will be complete with our grant making and investing, actually, by 2019.
Okay.
So in 2 years.
Lale,
So,
what's the most significant new thing you've done at Open Society?
okay, and I'll answer with something concrete as well. You know, look, we were somewhat blindsided by the election's results, although again, as some of the panelists have said, the trends or forces that were at play would have been the same no matter who was elected. You know, the unevenly distributed benefits of globalization, technology, its role in misinformation, racial anxiety, these were all at fever pitch in the US, even if the electoral result had been different. In any event, the election happened. We were pretty sobered immediately. We did two things. One was to put 50% of our 2018 budgeted funds on hold, pending a development of a new strategy, which we now have, as of day before yesterday. But very immediately, the most immediate thing we did was to stand up an initiative called Communities Against Hate, and we did that within 2 weeks of the election. We stood up a $10 million program through which we distributed money in 3 ways, and they're connected. The first was to set up a reporting mechanism where people can report incidents of hate and we can document them. We've never had good documentation mechanisms in the US, and so just even collecting information from as broad a swath of people across the country was very important, and so that has been stood up. It has a hotline. And once you report an incident, you're connected to a suite of social and legal services that you may need to help yourself. And so those were the sort of first 2 pieces. And then the third piece, which is the largest piece of it, were grants to community organizations, to frontline organizations all over the country that are trying to find ways to be resilient and support their members, whether they're trans members, whether they're Muslims, whether they're Somali refugees, whoever they are, in this period. So that program is now actually over. We did an open call, ran it for 8 weeks. We will have made about 100 grants when we're all done. We've made about 70 already. And what's actually really striking is we got over 1,000 applications and $85 million worth was the total need represented by that number. So in 8 weeks, what we received for anti-hate work in the US was $85 million, which gives us a sense, I think, of the real need there is. A lot of people want to feel solidarity with one another, despite the sort of bellicose rhetoric coming out of the administration on some of these issues. So we are now trying to think of how to take this pluralism work forward in some kind of a broader campaign to foster it with partners. We don't want to do this. This is certainly not something we can do alone, given our own, given who our donor is and sort of our bogeyman status, I suppose, in today's America. So we're pretty, I mean, the Communities Against Hate work hopefully will continue.
And what pool of money were you able to distribute, or are you going to be able to distribute?
We've done the 10 million for the Communities Against, on this grants program, and it's, two pieces of it will continue. The social and legal services and the documentation and hotline and so on are going to continue. The grants program was delimited, but we're not throwing out the grants that didn't get funded. We're going through them, curating them, seeing if other funders want to take portions that align with their own interests. For example, there are many from the immigrant rights communities. We already do a lot of work on immigrant rights, so we thought we would share them. So we're still mining that data for. And we're also, it's the first time we were able to work this fast. We had 80 volunteers from around Open Society all over the world. Everybody wanted to help. Our colleagues from Bulgaria to, you name it, said, look, we want to help process these grants. So this became this giant decentralized grant-making program, the likes of which we've never done, but maybe Pia teaches us a thing or two about moving faster than we, at warp speed for us. And it was possible. We haven't yet examined all the grants or anything, and we obviously made it much looser because these were community organizations we'd never have access to. So we've also learned, I think, something about organizations at the front lines. As a national organization, we've learned about groups we may never have touched.
So these were, many of them, first-time grantees.
Many. I mean, there are mosques and synagogues who requested security and surveillance apparatus. There were community centers that serve marginalized populations that needed something or other. A group of ministers in South Dakota asked if they could have funds to ensure that their Somali neighbors were walked to their workplaces by a neighbor so that they could get to workplaces safely. I mean, these are not the kinds of grants we make normally, so we really saw some incredible, a tremendous amount of compassion in the American population at the same time as we see, sort of, as I said, a lot of anger and a lot of hate at the federal level from some quarters.
It's encouraging.
I think it's really interesting that for all of us in philanthropy, this moment is challenging us. And so I think the best work is what you're describing, the kinds of things, the ways in which our institutions have had to be really resilient. At Ford, at our first trustees meeting, I said, we're going to ask for more payout this year. Because we are going to be making a rapid response to new opportunities, if you will, and we're going to have to think about how to deploy our resources in ways and in areas where we might not have, or we might have been doing it. So we had, as a part of our advocacy program, a very specific focus that was really rather nascent on Muslim community. And so we're growing that. Obviously we're gonna grow that. But the larger question is, and I think, what Pia and at OSF, what we do, and this is why we shouldn't, in this moment, just have a convulsion and change things. The basic things that we do. So at the Ford Foundation, the 3 I's still matter more than anything else. Investing in institutions, because at the end of the day, it's institutions that sustain movements. Investing in individuals, investing through fellowships, through individual leadership programs, in their ideas. And so people are right now coming to all of us with really interesting ideas about ways in which they can respond to this moment, but beyond this moment, because if we are to address the underlying challenges of the failure of our democratic institutions, I should say our democratic systems, because we have democratic institutions that are what we need now more than ever. It's those institutions. Imagine if today we didn't have in the United States the ACLU, the legal defense funds, the Muslim rights organizations, the women's rights organizations. These are all institutions that have been around, many of them, for decades. And for some of us, legacy foundations who are sometimes critiqued because I had one person say, well, you're funding these same organizations you've been funding since the 1960s. Right. Where's the innovation at the Ford Foundation? You're doing the same, well, we're not chasing the shiny new objects. Because at the end of the day, these institutions from the 1960s to 2017 and beyond will be what helps sustain our democracy. Yeah.
So I have a gazillion more questions, but I want to give you all a chance. So let's take a couple of quick audience and questions. We do want questions. You're all familiar with Twitter, I assume. Make it a Twitter-length question if you can, please. So, in the interest of diversity, we're going to go there and then here.
My name is Natalie Bridgman Fields with Accountability Council, and a lot of our work here focuses on not the flash rapid response, but the hard work of justice all around the world, domestically, internationally. I think what we're all confronting that might be new is how corruption is related to it. And I would love to hear your insights into how we can treat corruption internationally, the networks of corruption, as central to the challenges we're all facing, because but for the fake news, the disinformation, the spread of lies, the manipulation that corruption is creating throughout our economy and our society, we're like fleas on a beast. And so all our work will continue if it's not focused on corruption, but how can we get it tied into funding sources and other organizations so that we're working cohesively?
Okay, and let's just take one answer to each question so we give people a chance. So do you want to speak on corruption, Minister?
Actually, I do, because not only in our own societies, I'm from the Netherlands, and we're very high on the list of countries that manage to deal with corruption. So we're quite in a good space. But in the work that we've been doing in other countries, we've seen that all spheres of life are affected by corruption, and poor people pay the highest price for corruption in any way. If it's about finances or when it's about information. And so corruption actually feeds inequality, and inequality to me is the mother of all crises. Now, so what do we need to do? I think there's a lot to say about it, but I'll just mention a few points. One is that we continue to work with citizens to strengthen their voice. And I think governments need to fund NGOs that are critical for governments, that help citizens get that voice. Secondly, we need to engage the private sector. We've been working a lot with the Dutch private sector on how they can, in the way that they do their business, can tackle corruption, which is more than not be part of a corrupt system or to not pay off yourself, but it's how to tackle that. And thirdly, I think there has been a bit of a lack of outspokenness on all of our part to talk about corruption, because working in poor countries and talking about corruption was saying, like, you know, we fund these countries, but sorry, we know they're corrupt. Well, I mean, I think the message is that cannot be sustained. We need to stand up and also talk to governments about this. We stopped bilateral funding. I stopped bilateral funding to South Sudan in 2014 through the government because of corruption, which was not, I mean, we were the first and the only ones, and everyone was like very critical about it. But you know, I would have preferred not to be right, but I was very, very right in doing so. So we need to really be more aggressive, if you want, on the issue. Yeah.
And we have to call it out in our own systems too,
yeah.
Because this is a challenge. I once had a person in a forum like this raise their hand and said, "Oh, it must be so difficult for the Ford Foundation because you work in these countries in Africa where the government is just so corrupt. You have to practically bring a suitcase of money when you meet with someone to get anything done." And I said, "Oh yes, madam, it's just so terrible." And fortunately in the United States, we do all of that and it's legal. And so, you know, you actually don't have to bring a suitcase of cash. You can just bring your American Express card and you can literally gain access to the political system by simply writing a check. And it's all legal. And it's very corrupting.
Well, I want to ask in a few minutes what we can do about that, or what you can do about that. But let's take another question first.
Tim Wainwright from Action on Disability and Development. We work as an ally to the movement of disabled people around the world. So I actually wanted to, dare I say it, utter a few words of hope, or, you know. In the area I work in, my question is about is are there points of connection that span the political spectrum. And I see it in the area I work on, but I suspect there are others too. So in the area I work on disability, just a couple of examples. Yes. One is in the US, there are Tea Party senators who have campaigned for the ratification by the US of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And of course, as we all know, the US never ratifies anything, does it? So, and it came it nearly did. It nearly ratified that one. And here in the UK, the relatively recently elected, appointed Minister for International Development, Priti Patel. Well, I'm another hat I wear is I'm chair of Bond, which is the umbrella organisation in the UK. So I was with her 2 weeks ago. She was speaking at the Bond conference, and at the Bond conference, she stood up and she said, "I am here. I want to defend civil society space, and in terms of disability, it's the defining theme for her. You know, she is really strong on disability." And yet, you know, I suspect there's a lot of people in this room would not agree with her political views. You know, she's one of the key members of the kind of Brexit group around Theresa May and so on. So I suppose my question is, is disability and other issues, maybe faith, for instance, which span the political divide, which can be points of connection? And I couldn't end this opportunity to not mention and celebrate the fact that 2 days ago, the new president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, is the first person, and is by no means the first head of state who's disabled, but is the first head of state who's disabled who celebrates that fact and is open about that fact. So I thought that was also a moment for positivity.
Yeah.
Great question, even a little longer than Twitter, but let's get an answer. Issues that actually can unify or appeal to a broader base.
Well, certainly in the United States, I mean, we look at criminal justice reform, and the consensus that our criminal justice system is broken is bipartisan. We have the Koch brothers and Open Society Foundation and Ford Foundation on the same page on that issue, and they may not come at it from the perspective of racial, for example, as we do, the perspective of racism in our society, but the objectives remain the same. So that's one example. We could do more, but I don't want to.
Yeah, I think one other example is, and you named it, is the role of the faith community. You know, they've always been strong on human rights issues like torture and so on, but they're really coming forward on the sanctuary movement around immigrants' rights, and you know, they're going to try and shelter them in churches and so on and so forth. So they're becoming a bigger and bigger voice in the immigrant rights movement, and it's not just faith. I would say that where some of the cleavages in American society could be healed are at the level of values, and that's where faith is relevant. It's the values of faith and beyond faith, more common values about human dignity, human decency. And some of the new and emerging activists, I hope Darren, I don't know if this conflicts with what you were saying, but I'm finding a lot of hope in them, because when I listen to them, I hear them speak in terms of values and not policies. They definitely don't want the stamp of traditional philanthropy either, so it's going to be complicated negotiation trying to sort of help them become real institutions, and also help them understand that they shouldn't dissipate the existing energy of activism that is already there, but to use it. And anyhow, but the broader point being, I do hear them speaking in this very fresh language of values and not policies, and of reinforcing one another, so that they scale each other's impact. They all use technology, and by linking the indivisible movement to the Women's March movement, you have 8 million people hearing the same thing and being able to participate in the largest US march ever on January 21 or whatever. But I do think faith, and just more broadly, a values conversation is the conversation Americans in the middle of, especially the middle of America, non-coastal America, have to have. And I hope they do.
Let's go to the woman on the aisle right there. Pardon me.
Hi, I'm Melanie Edwards, and with Mobile Metrics, and we do research and delivery of services into low-income communities by hiring locals from the communities to actually do the research and delivery. I've been 7 years in Brazil working in the favelas, so inequality is right there, and as heaven knows, I know corruption and what life is living under corruption, which propelled me when the election happened to really come home. I grew up on a farm outside of a small town in Missouri.
Right to the question, please.
Sorry.
That's all right.
But that says context to the question about giving voice. And what kinds of things, back to Darren's point, this culture of the Midwest being missed, what kinds of initiatives that are giving voice or that you're looking toward? And how are you going to move that to make a difference?
Can I take this one?
Go ahead.
So I also am interested in, especially in the US, in not being so US-centric, because I think so many solutions to so many of our deepest divides are actually elsewhere. And you spoke of being from Brazil. So I just wanted to mention, or living in Brazil from a farm, got it. I mean, there is an activation among at least community foundations as well. So there is the Grassroots Climate Solutions Fund, and it's 4 community foundations coming together to bring grassroots climate solutions from the Global South to everywhere globally. And I was thinking about this effort where, these community funds supported, and I want to say this well, with organized groups of impacted people. So when we support, whether it's in the Midwest or whether it's in Brazil, organized groups of impacted people, a lot can happen. And those kinds of grassroots efforts get the less than 1% of international funds. So, and yet they have so many solutions. And in Brazil, they have stopped dams from being built, for instance. These dams would have, destroyed sort of indigenous lands. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is how to bring these kinds of solutions from the Global South to, folks who think about funding in the Global North. One of the partners that we have is the International Development Exchange. One of the board members is sitting right here. And I think there is this wisdom that we in the U.S. neglect to tap, Minister Woman, yes. From so many places that have dealt with corruption, that have these same sort of issues. And I think one of the things that's actually kind of great, there's so many things that are not great about the Trump administration, but one of the things is it sort of levels this American exceptionalism. Right? So what's happened globally in terms of some populist movements or like Brexit, it gets us to understand that we're part of an international system and not just isolated on our own continent. So,
did you want to?
Very, very, very quickly, you asked about what some of the kinds of interventions are, and I think one of the things we were thinking about is the role of sort of media and digital infrastructure in the middle of the country. If you look at a map of where broadband is in the United States, you'll see a massive gap in the middle of the country. So that's just a fact that I'm not sure we will be able to solve, but because it involves companies and others who have deep interests that may make it difficult. But there's also rural media having sort of authentic, progressive, forward-thinking media voices that we may be able to sort of lift up. But in terms of the global solutions, I mean, I do think since we are in an international foundation, our conversations have been more and more joined up with our colleagues in other, dealing with illiberal democracy elsewhere. And in fact, we are learning much more from them than they from us. But since the U.S. has the import it does on the world stage, it's very important to them that we better not, slip slide the same way. And one of the things that did come up just 2 days ago is a board member who's from India said, Geeta Sen said, the role of the courts, it's in Modi's India has become increasingly important. And we were talking about the role of the courts and how important it is to protect the judiciary as an institution from attack in the US. It has already been attacked, but it's also stood up. It's been one of the only checks on the executive so far, and it looks like it might continue to be. So it's also another place where you do see these commonalities across the globe, and you can learn from others.
So I want to follow up on just 2 themes or points that have been made here, and then I'm going to go right back to you. The first is on this question of broken democracy. Michael Porter was here yesterday. He gave a long talk about what's wrong with really the system and structure of government, how we should have nonpartisan primaries, redistricting in a more, again, nonpartisan way, whatever the specifics. And he called for, I think he called it, a new philanthropy political philanthropy. So are any of you thinking about what that might mean, or thinking about how you can, in a way, you've all said you don't think democracy is working so well, how you all might try to help it work better.
But could I just, democracy not working well, with all due respect, we had elections 2 weeks ago, we had an 80% turnout. We did have a problem. Yeah. I mean, it's not all rosy and good, because if you look at the younger people between 18 and 25, the ones that do not have a higher education, the turnout was much lower. So we have an issue ourselves, but we have a very pluriform system. We have been looking to the US primaries as an example to engage many people who are not members of the party but who'd like to engage. So I do see all the issues that all of you mentioned, but I would encourage you to look also for the positive facts that, I mean, we look, really the primaries are great, having all these people in villages coming together in sports halls and talking about politics. I would love to have that in my neighborhood. So, and it's not, the fact that the US democracy has issues is not to say that all of our democracies are in trouble.
Sorry. I meant...
I couldn't agree with you more, and I was speaking specifically about the U.S.
democracy.
But with all due respect, if the U.S. democracy is not working, the implication for the planet is enormous. And so we see it. I mean, you're out raising money now, doing something you actually shouldn't be doing.
Exactly.
Because something happened in the United States, because someone in Western Pennsylvania voted in a particular way. So the implications for what happens in our democracy have profound impact on the world. And so I don't mean to sound parochial or nationalistic. It's because I'm an internationalist that I feel so strongly that what we have to, in the US, make our democracy work, because it means it will work not only for us, but for the world. And so I'm actually a believer that what we're going to have to do to make our democracy, it's not that we, philanthropy, can make anything happen, but what we can do, hopefully, is resource the grassroots movement building, because when most people are not participating, are not voting, we really don't have a representative democracy. I mean, what we need is for people to feel that they have a reason to participate. And I'm actually very hopeful, because I think, you know, one of the privileges, the many privileges of being in philanthropy, is that every day you get to be inspired. If I'm feeling down, all I need to do is go to the office. Because every day, amazing people, some of you in this audience, parade through the Ford Foundation doors, and we sit and talk about what you are doing, and it's just amazing. It's incredibly inspiring and motivating for us. And it does give me hope. I mean, I'm actually, you know, a hopeless hopeaholic. I absolutely believe that, and I always say at the Ford Foundation, we're in the business of hope. And so I absolutely am a believer, but we have been sobered, and we have to internalize the reality that we are fighting for the very soul of our democracy. And that's our work in philanthropy, to support all of you who are doing that work every day.
I'm not sure I got an answer, though, in terms of...
Sorry.
Can I try?
Try.
Do you want to ask the question again? Or?
Sorry, Darren.
You're just bringing up for me, Darren, and thank you. I think I might also be a hopeaholic. But I do want to say that I want to remind myself that philanthropy cannot replace government. Exactly. So to me, the role of philanthropy isn't to make up for what government isn't doing, whether it's international or domestic, but it is actually to push democracy in the US to behave like a democracy in the US. So that means funding advocacy, that means thinking about working inside and outside strategies. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in California is, supposedly we're a progressive blue state, and lots of times we spend tens of millions of dollars passing legislation, but our sheriffs and DAs don't implement. Right? So I'm looking at these sheriff and DA races in the midterm elections, some of which go completely uncontested and have incumbents that absolutely won't, if there's a bill passed to support environmental or ecological justice or for women's rights or for workers' rights, they literally will be a blockade around implementation. So one of the ways I think philanthropy can help democracy work better is to just cultivate a more diverse pool of people to think about things like DA and sheriff's races, which are $60,000 campaigns. And that's, that's something we can support, not necessarily to back, again, in the C4 realm, not to back specific candidates, but to back a more diverse pool of candidates, for instance, a woman, to run for any of these seats. So I think there are strategic ways that philanthropy can support democracy to behave much better, and remembering that we can't, even Gates and all of the big foundations combined cannot replace, what is supposed to be just public good, education, housing, the basics. So I just wanted to say that.
All right, so my last question is about philanthropy itself, and then I'm going to go back to you folks. You could argue, and some have argued, that philanthropy itself is elitist, undemocratic. Certainly foundations are the least accountable institutions I've ever written about in my many years as a reporter. How should philanthropy be more democratized? How? And I'll give you a small personal example. My daughter works at a small foundation called the Estrella Foundation. They do something called participatory grant making, where they bring beneficiaries to a space, essentially say, we have a pool of money, and we're going to let you folks decide who gets it and how it's divvied up. Are there other ways for philanthropy to kind of get out of the coastal towers that it's segregated in? How do we democratize it, if indeed we should?
Can you define democratize a little bit better in the sense of, are you talking about there are internal procedures which are problematic and slow and cumbersome, et cetera, for some of the older, larger philanthropies? And then the example you gave, I just wanted to understand, with Estrella, is it that they bring in potential grantee organizations? Okay, so
And by democratize, I mean, I was a business reporter for many years. At least every big company has to have an annual meeting where shareholders can show up and ask questions. I've never heard of a foundation saying, hey, we're going to have a big public meeting, all our grantees and anyone else can come and talk to us. I mean, these are very, very sheltered, impermeable institutions, I think. So does it need to change, and how?
Probably. I'm going to just mention one thing that we've done recently, and Darren, you probably have a lot more to say from your perch at Ford on this, but yes, we are slow. Black Lives Matter hit us, and we didn't know quite how to resource the movement and movements more generally now, including the new activism. It's going to be difficult. There is one thing we've done internally, and that's why I was sort of trying to understand the difference between external and internal accountability, but it actually has external ramifications, which is that we've delegated, grant-making authority used to be sort of, the grant has to sort of ride up the chain from the program officer to a manager to a director before it's approved, but we actually now have program officers approve grants below a pretty substantial threshold by themselves. And the reason I think in our thinking that this made sense was that they're seen as doctors in a hospital. They're the one sort of person in an organization that has the best information on an organization. So why is the grant not being approved by the program officer who has the relationship with the grantee, who knows it's about the organization's strengths and weaknesses? Why is it then being second guessed and judged about? So that is one thing that the Open Society has implemented and that we're doing. That at least democratizes things on the internal side.
Interesting. Anyone else?
So I think this is a fraught conversation. It's fraught because we speak from a perspective of privilege, meaning foundations. And so there are structural, regulatory frameworks that contribute to this, and there are cultural norms and practices, right? So I think that we have to address this issue from the standpoint of governance by asking who's on the boards of these institutions. I mean, that is a fundamental question that I think is important. that makes, again, people really uncomfortable. I think we have to ask the question of how do we use our privilege? So this is much less about sort of throwing rocks at philanthropy and saying, shame on you because you are cloistered and you are. I actually don't think, I mean, I can only speak for the Ford Foundation. I don't find the Ford Foundation to be a cloistered ivory tower kind of an institution. Do we have challenges with being inaccessible and somewhat remote because people don't return their emails as fast as I want them to or whatever? Sure, we have these sort of practices, but I do think that when you say, let's call our shareholders together, it's really hard because I say this all the time, and with all due respect, in orientation, I say to program officers, every day you will meet someone who will tell you how to spend the foundation's money better, and that you're stupid. You've missed the boat because you're not funding X, Y, and Z. And so it happens every day. Every day someone walks up to me. I had gotten a big disagreement because someone said, you're moving out of K through 12 in the United States, and shame on you, Ford Foundation has been in this space. And you try to explain that the K through 12 reform space is so crowded in the United States with philanthropy that we make a decision to, but there's always someone who will say, well, that was a stupid mistake that you made. And so we have to calibrate how to be accessible, how to be open, how to be responsive, but also how to be strategic. And when you're strategic, you actually, like any enterprise that has to have a strategy, decisions have to be made about what's in, what you're going to invest in, and what you're not going to invest in. And when you choose to not invest in certain things, there are communities, stakeholders, people who will be offended and who will take it very personally that you're not funding in this area anymore. So it's a fraught kind of, because you're right, we are privileged. We are, as a sector, too isolated. And so we have to get better at that.
But I mean, what I thought you were going to say is something like the build commitment that you've made, which is really significant, is a form of democratization because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't you essentially saying to these organizations, you know better how to spend this money than we do? We're not going to...
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to make this about I personally have a very strong point of view about this because I was a grantee. And so I try to infuse into my own perspective into what we do. So one of the reasons I wrote that, essay that got so much attention about general support was because I know what it feels like to have to live off of project support. You actually can't live off of project support because your funders actually aren't paying you the full cost of the project. And we all know that that whole sort of theater that's performed around that is just a fiction. So sure, let's call that out and let's really, really talk about how we engage in a more authentic way. And to me, that's how you get at this, by being authentic, by being candid on both sides, but being open. And I don't know, I mean, to me, so much of this is just about the culture of organizations and we have benefited we in philanthropy have benefited from this culture of privilege. And we do need to be called on that.
Pia, you want to say
I'll
something?
say something that's not about
And then we'll go
internal
out.
philanthropic culture, which is, I think that tax law could change in terms of philanthropies being a sort of tax haven for billions of dollars. So I think, we could talk about the processes of like relationality of power in philanthropy, but one of the things I've thought about a lot is just going at even the 5% payout. Or going at something like, if endowments are larger than this many billions or this many millions, the requirement for payout is higher. Now, I live in a country where the wealthiest people pay the lowest tax bracket, right? And that is also true of organizations. And so if you're a nonprofit, you're probably paying more taxes than a large endowed university in terms of tax bracket. So just as a structural solution for democratizing, because when I think one of the things I hear about your question is how do you transfer wealth? you know, because these are dollars that have been then taken out of the public circulation and sort of housed in these things called funds or donor advised funds or whatever they are, and they are not being put back into society. So how do we get more of them out there and into the hands of the people who are doing the grassroots work or trying to provide services? So I think one of the things I've been thinking about is just tax law when it comes to endowments and when it comes to philanthropies.
Interesting. Wow. This is power. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. So I'm from the Global South, and I'm one of those people who perpetually feel like a second-class citizen in the presence of foundations. So how do we, in the Global South, who give our lives to change every day, get you to take us seriously? And I'm giving my life to this particular issue around how do we get you to, because we know stuff. We work there every day. And then we get no, but the foundation decided these are the priorities, and they're nowhere near what the real priorities need to be, and you're dead. There's no opportunity to influence that. There's no way to influence it. That's democratization. Is for, I think, for us who are doing the work on the ground, to be invited to be part of your strategy process. But I'd be interested to know what you think the answer is.
I think in our case, for example, grantees are integral and were integral to our strategy process. And I think if you were to look at our grantees in most of the places we work, I mean, let's just take South Africa. I mean, I think if you look at our portfolio of grantees in South Africa, they're pretty radical organizations, from just the Zero campaign. I mean, the work around AIDS and HIV and changing culture, and the work around demanding free education and higher education. I mean, there's a lot of work, and the groups who we're funding are doing things that are disruptive. And I mean, when you're working in a country like South Africa and you, as a foundation, are saying to the grantee community, we have a situation in South Africa where we still have most of the NGO sector led not by Black Africans, but by white South Africans. And so that's an uncomfortable conversation to have. But it has to be had, because if we actually are to have true Black empowerment in South Africa, we have to be having that conversation. And so we get in the middle of a lot of things that where people say, why are you doing this, or you're missing the boat, or you're funding the wrong thing, and we do the best we can, but there is always going to be some who feel left out. I think your point about second class I find very troubling, and I'm very sorry to hear that, because I know what it feels like to live in a community, to live in a Black community in America, and be running an NGO when white people come in and tell you what they think you need for your community, or tell you what is missing from the disc. So but I think the whole point is you actually have the power and the knowledge, and this is about how we respect and appreciate authentic knowledge and evidence, that we not privilege the evidence or the knowledge that comes with having a degree from the Kennedy School over someone whose lived experience in a rural village, in a slum, in a neighborhood is just critical to, and so to my mind, that's how we get better. We'll never be perfect at it, but we have to be on the journey, and I so appreciate you asking that question.
Could I just add one example from my days at Mama Cash, which is, well, almost 20 years ago, but a very successful way, I think, to engage everyone, because we felt as Mama Cash, we were part of the feminist movement, and our role was to fund part of that movement. And so what we did on request of friends, activists from the Global South, is to not only give out grants to programs and organizations, but to give out a grant to women who wanted to start their own fund in the place that they were, be it Mexico, be it Ghana, be it South Africa, be it Brazil, and to enable them with that funding to raise their own money and to create their own organization, which they then could carry off, and without anyone interfering with the funding that they would do. So in terms of what you fund, there's different strategies that you could follow. But also from your side, you could decide to make your own foundation. Who is inhibiting you from raising your own funds? Make sure that you have the knowledge and the capacity and that you get money to do that. So.
There and then, yes.
Hi, Bennett Rathbun with Hope on a String. We use music and the arts to empower youth in Haiti. Robert Putnam wrote a great book a while ago called Bowling Alone, which talked about the erosion of social capital at the community level, and I think predicted a lot of these fault lines that we're talking about this week. So I'm wondering what big philanthropy can do to engage more at the community level, invest in these institutions that get people together talking and bridging these divides.
Well, one of the things we can do is to fund social scientists like Robert Putnam, which many, Bob will be the first to tell you that his work has been made possible because of foundation support. And not only Bowling Alone, but the more recent work that he did that really was prescient, explaining what's happening in industrial America. I think it is not realistic to believe that large foundations themselves are going to have the capacity to go and work in neighborhoods. It's just not feasible, and I don't mean that in a... So what we have to do is work with those intermediaries, and Mama Cash is one such example of the kinds of organizations that we can help support and help strengthen so that they in turn are working with communities in an authentic way. And so, we get criticized because we've got, some would say, too much staff. So to actually do the kind of grant making when you're making $550 million a year in grants that brings program officers, with a check to a community, which means if you're really working at the grassroots, it's not going to be, a huge amount of money. It just isn't feasible from a business model. So, but that doesn't let us off the hook. It means then when we fund organizations like a Mama Cash or, the hundreds of intermediaries we do fund at the foundation, we've got to make them accountable for having those kinds of authentic relationships and having people who look like the people who are being impacted also be in charge at those intermediaries.
Just a quick twist on that, on your question, is that there is a little bit of it is happening through the new activism. So, for example, the Women's March was initially launched by 3 or 4 women. They had 400 organizers working across the country. They decided after the march to make it a thing, and they got in touch with these 400 organizers. Now each of those 400 organizers has an entire network. So now this, you've got a bunch of people coming together and they have conversations in their communities. That's exactly what they do. And Indivisible, for example, the other group that's trying to model itself on the Tea Party, it's a different way of moving, but it is, again, a local level conversation that people are having together and then with their congressperson, right? There are now 5,800 Indivisible. They started with a document in November, and there are now 5,800 Indivisibles in America, more than one in every congressional district. So those people are also in each congressional district having a conversation about what kinds of draconian policy reforms they're seeing, or good things, affirmative policy reforms they'd like to see, and trying to talk to their congressman. So in 2 different ways, these narrative conversations and these policy conversations are happening, I think.
Yeah, and I think then one more after this and we'll be out of time.
Hi, this question is a little bit for Darren because you've spoken about it, and Lillian because you have a different perspective from American philanthropy. On philanthropy and social justice. I'm from Colombia, we do philanthropy advising. But it's always a complicated feeling to talk about philanthropy and social justice, and should we have less philanthropy and more social justice on the private sector side, and so that tension.
Yeah, well, I come from a country where we have a relatively fair tax system. So where our philanthropy is organized totally different, because there is no need to compensate for basic services that are not provided through taxation. And so I would answer your question, yes. I think everyone has to be taxed, that if you are more resourceful, you should pay more taxes, and that public services should be distributed through the public service and checked, controlled, driven by democracy. And so, having said that, also we have our fair part of philanthropy and fundraising, and we do that because social change also needs funding, and you do not get always that funding from the public sector. And so, I mean, I would suggest, but of course, I mean, it's the system that I grew up with and now I'm able to also form. I do think that a system where there's more public, where there's more fair taxation does not create the kind of dilemmas that you are faced with, basically. So,
I mean, I think that it would be very, I so appreciate that idea of what you have.
Yeah, I mean, please don't leave the room thinking that the Netherlands does not have any issue, because that's really not true. But really, on some issues, we did quite well.
Yes, you are far ahead of much of us on many of these issues. And I would only say that I think, again, I will speak from the perspective of the United States. It is hard to imagine a more just society without philanthropy, because the work of philanthropy has been to help America be America, because on its own it won't happen, because the privileged and the powerful enjoy their privilege and their power. And particularly in a society like the United States, where we have a narrative that if you are wealthy, you have worked hard, you have a narrative that reflects your own personal sacrifice in order to get where you are, and therefore what you have, you've earned it. And no one else has a right to it. And so whether that narrative is fair and right, but that is what and so the role of philanthropy, which is power, because the resources that are represented and the names that are represented in American philanthropy that are the gold standards, whether it's Carnegie or Rockefeller or Ford or Johnson or MacArthur, those are names of people who were in families who were powerful and rich. And philanthropy now is challenging often the powerful and the rich. And the hard thing that I find sometimes is that people in philanthropy aren't comfortable with the word justice. I once had a colleague at another large foundation who we were working on a partnership with say, the documents that we were presenting to our boards, you have to take all of this justice stuff out of the documents, because my board is not really comfortable with all of this justice language. And let's talk about opportunity, because opportunity is comforting, because we like to believe that opportunity is all that's needed in order to have the American dream realized. And so the work of social justice philanthropy is to challenge that, to interrogate that, to demand more of that. So, you know, it's very hard to do social justice philanthropy, because a lot of philanthropists are really not fully comfortable with justice.
I'm sorry, I really am. We're 1 minute over.
Thank you, Mark.
Please fill out your evaluations, and before you do, please join me in thanking our panel, not just for coming, but for all the work that they do as well.